when the sky is high. No reason to stay around. Pick your hands and you can touch and fly.
Hello and welcome to the Aviatrix Book Review. I'm Liz Booker. My guest today is an award-winning children's and young adult author who has published 10 books. She also writes comics, including Bart Simpson comics, James Cameron's Avatar, and most recently, Wonder Woman. Her novel, Fly Girl, is the Aviatrix Book Club discussion book for September 2021. Her other works that highlight diversity in aviation include Who Were the Tuskegee Airmen, part of the New York Times best-selling Who Was book series, and The Blossom and the Firefly, about a Japanese kamikaze pilot in 1945 Japan. You can find her at her website, sherrilsmith.com. Sherri L. Smith, welcome.
Thank you so much, Liz. How are you?
I'm so excited to talk to you. This is like 10 years of excitement, having the opportunity to talk to you.
10 years in the making. It's amazing.
Yes, we will explain that later. In the meantime, though, for the people who might not have had a chance to read your novel, Fly Girl, would you mind giving us a summary of the book?
I'm happy to. I'll hold it up and hope it's not super blurry. Yay,
Nope,
it's
we
super
got it.
blurry, but there we go.
We got it.
Fly Girl is the story of a light-skinned Black girl named Ida Mae Jones who lives in Louisiana. And she is a farm girl who learned to fly on her father's crop duster. And when World War II happens, she wants to do something. She wants to contribute. She hears about a program called the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, which were a real group of civilian women trained to fly military planes here in the States to free up the men to fight overseas. That was the free a man to fight was sort of the slogan. And they flew everything from weather missions, target towing so that the men could practice shooting at a plane, which seems like the worst job in the world for the women, and testing repaired planes and flying new planes from factories to the coast to be shipped overseas. But when she goes in for the interview, she realizes that it's a Jim Crow army and they are not accepting African-American women. The program was controversial enough with civilian women flying man planes that they figured they wouldn't be able to get the program off the ground, no pun intended, if they also tried to integrate. And so Ida Mae, a legacy from her father's side of the family, she is very light-skinned, so she passes for white in order to join the WASP and serve her country.
So a lot of our audience are very familiar with the Women Air Force Service pilots and their story. And just to be very clear that this is absolutely a work of fiction imagined by you. I'm curious to know about the inception of this idea for you, both to write about the WASP and to create a character who is Black, who passes for white.
So years and years ago, this must have been 2004, 2005, maybe earlier. I can't remember now because I'm a woman of a certain age. I don't have to remember anymore.
So am I.
Right, that's what phones and the internet are for. I was working at a comic book company actually here in Los Angeles where I live, and I was doing the great Los Angeles pastime of sitting in traffic on the way home and listening to my local NPR radio station, KPCC, and they had a documentary come on called Radio Diaries. It's a radio documentary company. They do amazing things and you should check them out, radiodiaries.org. But they had a documentary about the WASP. And I was listening to it, and at one point a woman says, "We were heiresses and farm girls thrown together." And that really stuck in my head. And their whole story, I had like a very vague inkling about the WASP before that point, but that documentary just made it bloom. And the next day I went into work, and one of my good friends worked with me at the place, and she said, "Hey, did you hear that radio documentary about the WASP last night?" I said, "Yeah." And she goes, "I think that's your next book." And I said, "I think it is too."
Wow.
And so then I drove home trying to figure out, anybody can tell the story of the Women's Air Force Service pilots. It's history, it's there for the telling. What makes it a story I can tell? And in thinking that, I thought, well, these were women in a man's army facing all sorts of sexism and prejudice. Like, who else was facing that sort of challenge at the time? And then I was like, of course, African American people. So that's what gave me the idea for item A, to see how would you navigate that if you had this secret other difference that you would be ostracized for. So that's where she came from.
That's amazing. And it's great to hear that story. And while I emphasize that it is fiction, I found it to be based on the what I do know of the WASP to be very well researched, and that you definitely created those characters that you mentioned, the farm girls and the heiresses all together. You kind of pulled those things all together. How did that research look for you? How did you find the information you needed to write this book, and what personal experience did you draw on?
Okay. Gosh, it was hard. Okay. Like, think back to 2000 early, 2005, and the information and access is not what it is today. There is now a WASP museum that was still trying to get off the ground when I was researching. I did a lot of secondary sources, a lot of books, Yankee Doodle Gals. I can't remember the author's name, but I loved that. I find when you're writing historical fiction, kids' books are a great place to start because the information is all condensed. You get an overview, and if you're lucky, there's a bibliography of bigger books in the back that you can dive into. So I had a stack of books, and then I talked to pilots. My dad was an amateur. He was a flight student. He was learning to fly a Piper years ago. So I have talked to him about planes. My brother actually has a degree in aerospace engineering. So we grew up going, we lived in DC when I was a kid, and we grew up going to the Air and Space Museum. So there's some of that, just like DNA stuff. I was at a wedding, and one of my husband's good friends, one of the groomsmen, was a military helicopter pilot. And so I asked him, which was sort of a mistake. We're standing at the bar, and I was like, Rob, can you just tell me what it feels like to fly? Like, why do you love it? What do you feel about it? And he was like, the strong silent type. So he just stood there for a long time, and then he goes, the feeling of power and control.
Oh,
And I
those are the
said,
two words
okay.
that I use as well. So funny.
Well, I asked him, I said, okay, great. I'm like writing it down in my head. I'm like, okay, what else? And then he pauses and thinks for a long time and goes, yeah, power and control.
That's not real helpful.
No, it was not at all. So that's where then the imagination comes in. And there were other people, like Janet Harmon Bragg was an early African-American aviator who was rejected from the Women's Air Force Service pilot. So that also sort of fed into Ida's story. And, for African-Americans in aviation, and I'm doing research right now on another African-American aviator project, that sense of equality in the air, that there was a chance, for any next frontier, there's always the chance that you can level, or at least there's the dream that you can level the playing field in the next frontier. So there was definitely that sense there. And then aside from that, I have to say, I was a little timid, more than a little timid, and embarrassed. Like, I was afraid to find primary resources. There were women Air Force Service pilots around, but I had this sense that their story hadn't really been told. And me adding this African-American angle to it and fictionalizing it was not the same thing as telling their story. And I was afraid of insulting anybody. I don't know. I didn't want it to be a slight. So I just did as much research and then historical time period research as I could. My mom grew up in New Orleans, and so New Orleans is the setting for where Ida's from. And so I sort of did everything but sit down and actually talk to a WASP. And that sort of hung over me. But after the book came out, I'm a good friend of my husband's who grew up during the war. He reached out to me and he said, this is how I remember it. And that felt really good, just to get the time period right. I've had a few people, and I know your audience will reach out to me and tell me like, that plane is not a two-seater. And someone else, well, their grandmother will reach out and say, pantyhose didn't exist until, and so there are a couple of those, mistakes, which you always expect. But then I got a lovely email from a WASP who said, thank you for the trip down memory lane. And
Oh, that's
then
fabulous.
it was amazing, right? And then she went on to say, I had like a modern interpretation of one element of the book, that there was this doctor, Montserrat, I think his name was, but there was a doctor who would have the women write down when they had their periods. And that to me seemed very much like a man looking to disprove things. And she said, I always had the sense that he was trying to prove that we were capable.
Oh,
That she had the opposite feeling of it, which I wouldn't have gotten from the books that I was reading.
yeah, that's interesting.
So that would be that's sort of my my blind spot, I guess, was like getting over the fear of exposing it to someone who lived it, and then getting out of my own modern feminist perspective a little bit to see how it might actually have appeared to people at the time.
Well, I don't know if you know this. However, I think between then and now, the WASP story has been told very well by author Sarah Byrne Rickman, who she was a reporter originally, and then she ended up being at the International Women's Air and Space Museum, IWASM, and sat on a panel, or sat in on a panel of these women who came there. And she just from there embedded herself with these women, befriended them, and started telling their stories. She has published 11 books already, and she has another one coming out this month about another WASP. So that's good news. And those are her books that I have read, that, when I read this book, I see, I feel like it has the feel, Sweetwater, the descriptions of it match those that I've read elsewhere. So nicely done with that.
Thank you. I mean, that's the sort of the amazing thing, is I think it was the year after the book came out that the WASPs finally received a Congressional Medal of Honor. Yep. And then there's the museum finally opened, and then this, and then that. And
you're ahead of your time.
Well, it was so frustrating. I was like, oh my God, look at all the information that I could have had if I had only waited. So in the book, there's mention of there was a rumor that I had read in my research of a Latina pilot in the program. And but that's all I had, was a rumor. And then one day after the book came out, a few years after the book came out, I got an email from a woman, and she said, I read your author's note in the back. That was my mother.
No way.
Yeah, her first name's Vernita. I can't remember her last name, but now there's the women's library at the University of Texas has a WASP collection, and so you can find her photo there. And only in the past couple of years have I learned that there was also at least one Native American Women's Air Force Service pilot. Her last name was Rexroth, because her nickname was Sexy Rexy. And then it's amazing how it's a Doctor Who line, like how history is a lot more colorful than we think it is. Because they're only telling certain stories. And so if you can shine some light in those corners, it's amazing what you find.
Yeah. I am surprised to hear, because I wanted to ask about your reservations about writing this book. And I'm surprised to hear that your main sensitivity was toward the WASP and honoring them. I mean, obviously you would do that, but that trepidation that you had about talking to them. So this was published in 2009, and obviously the cultural conversation about, race has definitely heated up quite a bit over the last couple of years. And in publishing, it's a huge discussion point. For you, on your behalf, was more like concerned about writing a Black woman passing as white and how that would be received in the Black community. Did you receive any criticism about that, or were you concerned about that at all?
Again, with any world that I write, all I can do is the research to the best of my ability and stand by it. And then if someone comes to me and says this is inaccurate or this is inappropriate, my thought is I can say this is what I did. What more should I be doing? Not that it's their responsibility to tell me what I should be doing, but if I've stumbled somewhere, then I know I need to do better next time. You have to sort of face the music, and I think that because it's all an exercise in learning and an exercise in empathy. And so I did not get any blowback from the community, not anything direct or visible that I could see. I think that there are topics in every group that make people uncomfortable. And so whether there was stuff that I couldn't see, like, oh, that book never got picked up for this or for that because it was uncomfortable, I wouldn't know. So, it seems to have been well received. I will also say that the publishing industry tends to make a mistake in not marketing to the African-American audience unless they think it's a certain type of title. Maybe that'll get me in trouble more than the book would, but the majority of books in this country are purchased by college-educated Black women. But the majority of marketing is not to that audience. People think about it, women's books tend to be, chick lit and romance is what they will consciously think, let's go towards. And then when you think of, well, who reads chick lit and romance? It's like, oh, well, mainstream white audiences are reading, I don't know, Nora Roberts or something. I don't read enough romance to have all the names. And then, we have Alyssa Cole and I don't know, Terry McMillan for Black women, that's it. And that's not the audience. And it's that same thing in children's literature, that there are girl books and there are boy books.
Right.
And if there's a girl on the cover, then a boy shouldn't be reading it.
Right.
And if there's pink on the cover, then a boy shouldn't be reading it. And the fact is, there are books. And if anything, girls read everything. And boys are more likely to only read boy books because of the gatekeepers.
Right.
They're the people telling you can't read that when. So.
Do you have any sense?
Your question.
So no, that was. Well, I mean, if you had no reservations about it, you had no reservations.
On this book, that's true. That's true. Yeah. So I will say, so my latest book, which I have here, is The Blossom and the Firefly.
Firefly, which I mentioned in my introduction. Yeah.
This is definitely further afield because it is World War II. I have a little collection of World War II books that I seem to be building, even though I write a lot of other things. But that's World War II Japan, Japanese characters. That was definitely a step out of my comfort zone, out of my range of familiarity, but I approached it the same way with a lot of research, and not just on the time period, and because it's about a Tokotai, a kamikaze pilot. And so not just on the military aspects and the airplanes and things like that, but culturally. A lot of research went into that. I have a great book called The Japanese Mind that was written by students of English and students of Japanese to explain cultural concepts about Japan. And they wrote it with their teachers. And so that was really interesting to try to get some insight. Because if you say, Sherri, write a World War II American GI, I can wing it. It might sound like a patchwork of movies and books that I've seen and read, but I could figure out what that is. But then you say, write a Japanese GI in World War II, you got to hit the brakes and go, well, what is machismo in Japan at that time period? Or was it machismo? And don't conflate, like, I don't know, samurai stories with 1945, unless there is some sort of overlap. So that was a bigger challenge, and I was worried about that. And so again, I went to Japan, I took Japanese lessons, I did a lot of research, I did talk to people. And so like I'm a little older and wiser, so I'm less afraid of talking to people now. So running through Japan with an interpreter, and we spoke to like everybody who looked, over the age of 65. Were you here during the war? And tell us about it.
Wow.
Um, and face to face, you learn that some people are totally willing to talk about it, and other people want nothing to do with you. And but you keep digging so that you can bring the story to the page.
That's fabulous. I can't wait to read that book. And you have just quite the range of books that I learned more about, actually, listening to some other interviews that I'm really excited to read. But I've kind of found this sort of, so you've got your historical fiction and nonfiction, because you did write about the Tuskegee Airmen in
And I've got a few more nonfiction books coming
Yeah.
out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you going to tell us about this other Black pilot that you are writing about, or do we have to wait?
Well, it's not one person, it's a group of early African American aviators. I'm co-writing with someone else. So it's too early to talk about.
Okay.
Early days, but stay tuned.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
We'll
Yeah.
wait for that very eagerly. And then you've obviously got this family theme going on, and this aviation, which I feel like you kind of explained a little bit how you kind of got interested in aviation. But then there's also this Asian thing happening in your books. What's the draw for Asia for you? Well, because the Firefly, the Dragon and the Firefly is not the only book
It's
that you've written.
the Blossom and the Firefly is
Sorry.
Japan.
Yeah. Blossom and Firefly.
I guess I've never really thought about this. So hot, sour, salty, sweet. The main character is half Chinese American, half African American. I married a Chinese American guy, and wrote about.
Okay.
I had to write an essay actually for grad school, and I just wrote about cultural commonalities and differences, and talked about our two different cultures, and how like rice is sort of this universal connection between all food cultures, it seems to be. And from that, I ended up writing this book, sort of imagining if we had a kid, what would it be like? Pasadena is a contemporary noir mystery, and the main character's best friend, who is the victim, the beautiful dead girl that it circles around, is Korean American. The book was inspired by my husband's love of noir, and then I just thought about damaged people I knew, and I knew a lot of people, a lot of different ethnic backgrounds, and so I just sort of dove into my past for some inspiration there. So I don't know, just walking from, I think it's is it Linda Sue Park talks about writing at your kitchen table. The idea that if it's somebody who sits at your kitchen table, you might know their world well enough to be able to delve into it.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to go a little further afield than that, but it's a good starting spot. Yeah.
So to back up to this email conversation that we had 10 years ago, I had just started writing my book, and it was a mess, and I knew that, but and for me at the time, I was working in Los Angeles. I was the chief pilot there at the air station. And I was working with the first Black female helicopter pilot in the Coast Guard. She was only the second Black female pilot in the Coast Guard. And she was 10 years behind me. And I had worked with other African-American pilots, and, we had a little bit of a sense of camaraderie, just being in the minority, being as a woman and as a Black man in that environment. There are things that you experience that you are unsure of why those things are happening, and whether,
or you're very sure of why they're happening, but you can't
sometimes
really confirm
it.
But
often it's very insidious and subtle and really hard to pinpoint. And so it's good to have friends when you're in that environment. So for me, having been exposed to that experience and their experience, it's very important to me that there be examples in literature, in books for young Black women to see and to read about. So the Coast Guard has had a total of 5 Black female pilots in our history so far. And unless somebody has graduated from flight school in the last 6 months, that's as far as I know. And those women are very, very active, putting themselves out there in the community to be an example to people, to show them, what's possible. But the numbers remain very, very small. I didn't know if you were aware of what a small fraction of pilots in the world, but especially in the United States, are of color.
It doesn't surprise me. I fly a fair amount commercially, and I have to say, I throw a little party if there's a woman in the cockpit, because I think I've seen 2 of them, and they were both white. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. It is like most frontiers. Eventually they start to look like what everything else looked like, and so even though there were early African-American aviators, there was a lot blocking them from the skies. And then if you don't know that it's possible, you don't necessarily pursue it yourself. Nobody wants to have to be the one breaking ground. Some people do, but that takes a certain personality to be able to do it, and to always be fighting uphill is hard. So, I think about Benjamin O. Davis Jr., the leader of the Tuskegee Airmen. He was the 3rd African-American cadet at West Point. The previous one was his father. And then before that, it was someone in the 1800s. And Davis Jr., when he was there, the fact that there's a term for what they did to him, it shows you that it's institutionalized, but it's called silencing. None of the cadets would eat with him or speak to him unless it was under orders. So the fact that he graduated towards the top of his class with that, that's like being in solitary confinement for years, is not everybody can do that. That guy has a backbone of steel, and utterly determined, and wasn't a pilot when the opportunity to lead the Tuskegee Airmen came up. He was just like, okay, let's do this thing. Let's learn it. So that takes an incredible amount of fortitude, support from your family and loved ones. And unfortunately, not everybody has that. So that plus opportunity, right?
Right. Well, so this is one of the things that I'm super excited about. In the book club, I kind of tied your book to this recent publication of a book called A Pair of Wings, which is historical fiction about the life of Bessie Coleman. It's so well done. And I'm so excited and happy for Carol Hobson, who is a pilot, to have done the research and written it, and grateful for that. The reason I selected your book this year is because there are so few, and I knew your book, and I wanted some diversity on our reading list. It's really hard to find because they're just, if you look at how recent, me mentioning in the Coast Guard, having female pilots in there, this is something that I think about a lot as an author who wants to write a strong Black female pilot character in my own work as a white woman, especially considering own voices, and trying to promote those women to tell their own stories. But they're still working, they are flying is a very demanding career. And so to have the time to write your own story while you're in the middle of it is really hard. And so anyway, the point of all this is that when I first read your book, I was so thrilled, so excited to find a woman of color being presented in any aviation context, and that yours had been so well researched and so well done. Have you ever heard any feedback from anyone saying that they were inspired to consider aviation from reading your book?
I haven't. It would be amazing, but one thing that did happen is um, sort of like a dream come true. I got to do a book signing at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. So
That's awesome.
it really was. So like I'm set up in front of the little gift shop, and two people came by that really touched me. And one was a little boy whose family lived in Asia. I think he was in Japan, but they were coming to the States for a trip, and he had gotten his copy of Fly Girl through the Scholastic Book Club at his school in Japan. And he brought it with him to have me sign it. So it was all beat up. And that was really wonderful that there's like some kid on the other side of the planet who,
Absolutely.
I think, in the States, a librarian wouldn't have said, hey, little Asian kid, here's a book about a Black female pilot. I think you'll love it. That probably wouldn't have happened,
Yeah.
And so that was wonderful. And then there was an older woman with her adult daughters. They were Caucasian, but they were standing a few feet away, and the daughters were pushing their mother towards me. And she was leaning, how you dig in your heels and lean back like you don't want to go. And so I was just like, make eye contact and smile, and then don't make eye contact and see if it makes her more comfortable. And they finally shoved her up to me, and she said hello and asked me about the book. And then her daughters were like, our mom wanted to be a pilot,
Oh,
but she didn't know that there were other women, but like she was afraid to do it.
yeah.
And her mom was just like, their mother, she bought the book and she thanked me, but then she was like, I said, it's never too late, and
Yeah.
she was like, oh no, I think it is. And I'm like, really, it's never too late. And she lit up and sort of wafted out like on a cloud, and it was just really wonderful. So I don't know if she went home and looked up flight lessons, but I hope she did.
I do
I
too.
hope.
That's a great story. And that's got to be really rewarding as a writer.
It's unexpected, you tell the story because the story shows up and says, tell me. And it's like having a kid who says, I'm going to take the keys and go out. And you're like, oh, I hope to God nothing bad happens.
Yeah.
And if they come back and they're like, this amazing thing happened, it's,
Yeah.
a cause for celebration, but you don't expect it,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's pretty
Were there
wonderful.
any ways in which this book changed your life that you didn't expect?
I will say, I think Fly Girl is probably my most popular book, even though I've written, many more since then. And there's something about World War II aviation, apparently, that really got its hooks in me, and World War II in general. But, considering this is my third, it was the first of 3 to date World War II books. And so it got me into historical fiction, which I hadn't written before. It reunited me with my love of research. My mom was a teacher and had a library science degree, and my dad was a scientist. And, they were always like, look it up, look it up. And so getting a chance to do that. And then because of Fly Girl, I wrote the Who Were the Tuskegee Airmen book, which, let's see, so this is the Who, I can't angle it right, the Who HQ series of books, which is a series of nonfiction books for young readers about historical events and famous people, past and present. And I was at a book event, and I was just chatting with a woman at the appetizer table, and I was like, oh, what do you do? And she's the editor of this series. And I said, oh, have you ever done the Women's Air Force Service Pilots or the Tuskegee Airmen? And she was like, no, we haven't. Too bad you're too busy, because you wrote Fly Girl, like you could do that. And I was like, I will make time, I will do the thing.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
so that's how I got that book, which also I realize now the little step in between that was Fly Girl introduced me to my first Tuskegee Airman and my first WASP. I did an evening in conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Robert Friend, who had been a Tuskegee Airman, and then went on to work in Project Blue Book, the UFO research project for the Air Force. So I did an evening in conversation with him, and there was a Women's Air Force Service pilot in the audience.
Oh,
And
that's
so somewhere
great.
I have a photo of me with a wasp and a red tail.
Oh,
And
that's great.
yeah, it was really wonderful. And so like my copy of this book now, so this has changed my life. You won't be able to see it, but the inside of this book is signed by about 12 different Tuskegee Airmen.
Oh, that's fabulous. Good
So
for you.
that was life changing. And then yeah, every book, every World War II aviation book on my desk, and then the aviation book that I'm working on now are all because I was stuck in traffic listening to that radio documentary one day and already had the seeds of, a love of flight in my background. We would go to the Smithsonian as kids, and there was a movie, one of those IMAX movies that just fills the wall and you feel like you're in it. It was called To Fly.
Yeah,
And it felt like you were soaring over America. And yeah, that stays with you.
that's incredible. Are you ever going to fly something?
Okay, true talk. It terrifies me. Absolutely. I have no problem with flying in a big commercial plane. I have flown in one small plane. I couldn't even tell you what it was, but I was in Alaska. And in fact, that was the trip that that inspired me to finally write my first novel. But I was visiting a friend in Juneau, and he said, "You're going to fly up to Skagway, the gateway to the Yukon." And he drove me to the airport. And it's the only time in my life that I was asked to stand on a scale before they let me on the plane. And I was mortified, right? Like, oh, publicly stand on a scale. And then I was like, why? What happens if I'm too heavy? And they're like, oh, we'll just take some frozen halibut out of the back of the plane. It was me, pilot, co-pilot, and about 500 pounds of frozen fish.
That is
And
awesome.
tiny little plane, and we're flying up the coast, and the pilot goes, "Hey, do you see the sea lions over there?" And I said, "No." And like, I'm claustrophobic, and we're in this little thing, and I'm in the way back. And then he goes, "Look," and he tilts the plane. And I'm up against the window, like trying not to scream bloody murder because the plane is so small. But I was just like, yeah, I don't need this. I don't need this. My husband managed to guilt me up into a helicopter a few years ago in Italy, which was kind of cool. It was an avalanche rescue helicopter
Okay.
that our guy we were with like does high mountain rescue, but he was like, "Come on a flight with us, like we'll fly you around." And I think I'm not Catholic. If I was, I would have been counting rosary the whole time. But my husband was delighted, and I think when I was a little kid, I went up in a helicopter that had no doors at a county
Awesome.
fair. And I think that fixed it for me. Just like, I don't need that.
Okay, well, we will forgive you for
I'm so
not
sorry.
being
I
enamored
love
with
you and I
flying.
admire you. I
We
really do. I think it takes a certain something, just like it takes a certain something to want to be a pioneer in something.
Yeah.
The grit of a pilot is God-given and impressive, but God didn't give it to this one.
As is the grit of a writer. And that's what I was going to say. We will forgive you because you have elected to bring your fabulous writing talent, your curiosity, and your passion to writing our stories. So thank you.
Oh, I love that. I appreciate it. And it is absolutely my pleasure. I'm an armchair pilot.
That's okay. We'll allow it. Before we wrap up talking about the book and get a little more deeply into your writing background, I was wondering if there were any of your works that we didn't mention that you'd like to. I would like to mention Orleans because that book sounds very, very interesting and actually interestingly relevant based on COVID, right? Could you talk a little bit Orleans?
Yeah, so Orleans is set in a future post-disaster New Orleans, or after a series of man-made and natural catastrophes have devastated the Gulf Coast and given rise to a disease called, wait for it, Delta fever. The government can't cure it, so they build a quarantine wall from Florida to Texas, and they disown that part of the country. So the story is set 50 years later in the former city of New Orleans, where the survivors have gone tribal based on blood type, following the last sort of guidelines of the CDC to slow the spread of the disease. And it is the story of a 16-year-old girl trying to save the life of a newborn baby in that world. Orleans came about because my mom, as I said earlier, was from New Orleans, and she was there for Katrina and was an evacuee and a survivor. And the week that it took us to get her out, the story showed up for me, and all the research I was trying to do to get her out of the city. Law enforcement had fled, and in fact, I couldn't drive in to get her because there was tales that turned out to be true of law enforcement from outside towns shooting anybody trying to get in or out of the city. So the neighborhoods were being protected by street gangs, and I thought, what if it wasn't gangs and came with tribes? There's a lot of news about the city. Mayor Nagin at the time ridiculously referred to New Orleans as a chocolate city. And there's a sense that if it had not been a predominantly African-American city, there would have been a stronger emergency response, because they literally kept the Red Cross from going into the city to help people. Yeah. They said, oh, well, basically they tried to smoke them out, starve them out. Like, if we don't send in help, without stopping to think that the people who didn't leave couldn't leave.
Right.
No money, no car, nowhere to go. My mom's car got stuck in floodwaters. She couldn't get a plane out beforehand and had the option of sheltering in place in a house that had withstood hurricanes for 100 years, or being stuck in a car on the freeway.
Right.
And so she sheltered in place, and for the first time in 100 years, the house took damage, like serious damage. But she survived that. She did not survive the aftermath of rebuilding. So yeah, while I was trying to get my mom out of the city and I was doing all this research, and I was like, well, what if it wasn't racism that was causing conflict? What if it was something you couldn't see, like blood? And then one day, traffic again, driving home, the main character, Finn, started speaking to me. And I was like, I don't know what this is, but I left myself a voicemail at work. I'm like, I don't know what this is, and I just repeated some of what she said. And the story happened from there. And then research. I did a lot of environmental research. I called a doctor friend and said, I need a disease. It's a blood disease that does this. And she was like, let me introduce you to Noah Fetterman. He's a pediatric blood oncologist. And I had a great lunch with him saying, what would affect this and not that? And do you have any good side effects? So, and that's been great, because scientists have read the book and been like, oh, this is pretty accurate. And so then you have superstorms. Like, I had to change the name of one of the hurricanes in the book because the storm hit. And so then I decided to fictionalize all the names instead of using the list of storm names from NOAA. And now you have a pandemic with a Delta variant, and lots of big storms, and it's because it's based on science. The Delta thing is more of a little bit of kismet because the region is the Delta, but it makes people stop and think.
Yeah, and you have factions divided on something other than race.
Yeah.
So, a very relevant book. It sounds really good. I want to read that one.
Thank you.
Were there any others that we missed?
Oh, I've got like 9 or 10 books out. So
9 or 10.
So yeah, there are, but if everybody in the world would pick up one of the ones we talked about today, it would change my career. So that is fine.
Oh, that's great. Sherri, thank you so much for writing this book and for taking the time to talk about it.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun, and it's always nice to talk to someone who loves story.
I love story, and especially stories about aviation and women in aviation. So thank you. Thanks so much for listening. And if you were listening last month, I mistakenly said that we were going to be discussing Open Skies this month. That is the discussion book for October 2021, Open Skies, My Life as Afghanistan's First Female Pilot by Niloufar Rahmani and Adam Sykes. So please join us for that. I'll be announcing the winners of the Aviatrix Book Club drawing at the end of the month. everyone who participated in a virtual discussion of Fly Girl this month will be entered to win a signed copy of A Pair of Wings by Carol Hobson, which will be the February 2022 Aviatrix Book Club discussion book. Blue skies, everyone.
And here I am, I'm ready to go again. I'm ready to say